It begins with a sound that isn't there. A footstep on a floorboard in a house where you live alone. The soft click of a door easing shut in another room. A weight settling onto the edge of the bed behind you, and the certainty, sudden, total, and impossible to argue with, that you are not the only thing breathing in the dark. In the spring of 2020, that feeling stopped being rare. Across the world, in millions of homes that had never felt strange before, ordinary people began reporting the same thing. The sense of being watched. The shape in the doorway that dissolved when they turned to look. A touch on the shoulder in an empty room. And the strangest part of all was the timing. As the streets emptied and the world fell quieter than it had been in living memory, these reports did not fade into the silence. They climbed. So consider the question that a year of stillness left behind and never answered. When the noise of the world finally stopped, when more of humanity than ever before sat alone in quiet rooms listening, did we simply begin to hear what had always been there? Or did the silence open a door and let something in? To understand how strange that year truly was, you have to remember what it felt like. The first months of 2020, when a virus none of us could see swept across the planet, and one country at a time, the lights of ordinary life went out, schools closed, offices emptied, flights were grounded. By late March, somewhere around a third of the entire human population was living under some form of lockdown order, told to stay inside, to keep away from one another, to wait. The result was a kind of quiet the modern world had never experienced. Seismologists actually measured it. The constant hum of human activity, the trains and trucks and footsteps and machinery that vibrate through the very crust of the earth, dropped to its lowest level on record. Cities that never sleep went still. The skies emptied of planes. For the first time in generations, people in apartments and farmhouses and suburban streets could hear the small sounds their homes had always made beneath the noise of life. The settling of timber, the tick of cooling pipes, the wind finding gaps in old window frames. And in that stillness, something began to surface. In September of 2020, The Atlantic published a piece documenting a phenomenon that paranormal researchers and ordinary people had already begun to notice. Ghost sightings were up. Reports of what investigators call a sensed presence, the powerful, wordless feeling that someone unseen is sharing your space, were climbing. People who had lived in the same house for years, who had never once thought of it as haunted, were suddenly describing shadows in the hallway, cold spots that hadn't been there before, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through rooms they knew to be empty. You could even watch it happen in the data. Through 2020, online searches for ghosts, for hauntings, for "Is my house haunted?" surged. Some of that, surely, was boredom, a captive audience reaching for the eerie to fill long, formless days. But it wasn't only curiosity. People weren't just searching out of idle interest. They were searching because something had happened to them. Something in the house, something in the quiet. And in one particular house, in a small town in Rhode Island, the quiet was anything but empty. Drive far enough into the wooded northwest corner of Rhode Island to the town of Burrillville, and you'll come to an old farmhouse that has carried a dark reputation for the better part of a century. It's a modest place from the outside, a simple, weathered colonial built in the 1700s, surrounded by trees and stone walls, and the kind of silence that feels older than the building itself. But this is the house the world came to know as the Conjuringhouse. The real home that inspired the events behind one of the most famous horror films ever made. The place where, in the early 1970s, the Perron family claimed to have endured years of escalating torment, and where the paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, said they confronted something genuinely malevolent. For decades, the house simply sat there, trading hands, carrying its legend. But in 2019, it was purchased by Corey and Jennifer Heinzen, a couple deeply involved in paranormal investigation. They knew exactly what they were buying. They moved in, they listened, and according to them, the house began to wake up. Then came 2020. As the lockdowns descended and the world retreated indoors, the Heinzens reported that the activity in the house was intensifying, not fading in the empty stillness, but growing bolder. Footsteps, knocks, doors, the feeling of being watched in rooms where they stood alone. And so they did something that perfectly captured the strangeness of that year. They pointed cameras into the dark and switched on around-the-clock live stream, broadcasting the inside of the conjuringhouse to the world 24 hours a day. Picture what that meant. Across the planet, millions of people were trapped in their own homes, restless, sleepless, hungry for something, anything, to break the monotony of those endless nights. And here was a window into one of the most notorious haunted houses on Earth, streaming live into their living rooms at 3 in the morning. People watched for hours. They watched alone, in the dark, in the small hours, with nothing but the soft, static hiss of an empty old farmhouse. And they began to report what they saw. Viewers described doors that seemed to move on their own, shadows that crossed a hallway when no living person was in the building, shapes that formed in the grain of the darkness and then slid out of frame, movement, small, deliberate, impossible, in rooms that the owners confirmed were empty. The comments filled with people insisting they had just seen something, rewinding the feed, screen recording, comparing notes with strangers half a world away, a private haunting. The kind that for centuries had belonged only to the people who lived inside its walls, had become a shared experience. Thousands of isolated people, scattered across continents, all staring into the same dark room at the same moment, all feeling that same prickle at the back of the neck. The conjuring house had always been one house, with one family's fear inside it. In 2020, its fear went global. But here is what makes the story refuse to settle. If it had only been that one famous house, a place already steeped in legend, already primed to make viewers see ghosts in every flicker, it would be easy to explain away. A suggestible audience, a spooky reputation, and the human eye's endless talent for finding faces and figures in the dark. The trouble is, it wasn't only that house. It was everywhere. Across the United Kingdom and the United States, paranormal investigators and parapsychology researchers began, independently, to notice the same thing. Through 2020 and into 2021, the reports kept coming, and there were measurably more of them than before. More people, more places, more accounts of the same handful of experiences, described again and again by strangers who had never met, who had no famous haunted house to inspire them, just an ordinary home that had suddenly stopped feeling safe. The patterns were eerily consistent. The feeling of being watched, most of all, that primal certainty of eyes on the back of the neck in a locked and empty house. The sense of a presence standing just behind or just out of sight in a doorway. And the touches. People reported being touched, a hand on the shoulder, a brush against the arm, the weight of something sitting on the bed, in homes where they lived completely alone behind doors that had not opened in weeks. These weren't seasoned ghost hunters going looking for a thrill. Many of them were people who had never given the paranormal a second thought. People who, before that year, would have laughed at the idea. But now they were sitting in their own kitchens at midnight, in houses they had lived in for a decade, describing the unmistakable feeling that they were no longer alone, and finding, to their unease, that thousands of others were describing exactly the same thing. What made it so unsettling to the researchers logging these accounts wasn't any single dramatic case, it was the spread. The way the same specific experiences surfaced in a terraced house in northern England and a suburban home in the American Midwest and a city flat in between, all in the same window of time, all without contact, all matching. It was as if a single phenomenon had washed across the entire world at once, and the only thing those scattered homes had in common was the silence that had fallen over all of them. Which brings us to the explanation. Because mainstream science does have one, and it is a good one. It is grounded, it is rigorous, and it accounts for a great deal of what people described that year. The official answer is this: the spike was emotional, and it was neurological, and it had nothing to do with ghosts. Think about the conditions of that year. Fear, constant, low-grade, inescapable fear of an invisible threat. Grief, on a scale the modern world had rarely known, as hundreds of thousands of people lost loved ones, often without the chance to say goodbye. Anxiety, sleeplessness, and isolation, profound, prolonged, unnatural isolation, the kind human beings are simply not built to endure. We are a social species, wired to the core for the company of others, and suddenly, millions of us were cut off, alone in our homes for weeks and months on end. And then there was the silence itself. Scientists have long understood that sensory deprivation does strange things to the human brain. When the world goes quiet, when there is too little coming in through the senses, the brain does not simply switch off. It starts to fill the void. It generates, it hunts for signal in the noise, for meaning in the emptiness. And one of the deepest, oldest functions of the human mind is something researchers call agency detection. The instinct, carved into us by hundreds of thousands of years of survival, to sense the presence of another living thing nearby. That instinct kept our ancestors alive, the rustle in the grass that might be a predator, the shape in the dark that might be a rival. It was always safer to assume something was there than to be wrong and be eaten. So our brains became exquisitely tuned to detect presence, and that detector, scientists say, can misfire. In conditions of fear, exhaustion, grief, and silence, it can fire when nothing is there at all and produce that overwhelming, bone-deep certainty that you are being watched. It's the very same sensation, researchers point out, that soldiers describe in extreme combat stress, and that lone sailors and polar explorers and mountaineers report when pushed past the edge of endurance. The famous third man, the sensed companion who walks beside the exhausted and the isolated, watching over them, never speaking, never there. The brain, under enough strain, conjures company, and in 2020, the entire world was placed, all at once, under exactly the kind of strain that produces it. It is a powerful explanation. It is, in all likelihood, the truth of a great many of those reports, and it should bring a certain comfort, the idea that what people felt was their own grieving, frightened minds, doing what human minds have always done in the dark. And yet it explains the trigger. It does not quite explain everything that came through the door, because the science tells us why so many people, that year, were primed to sense a presence. What it struggles to fully account for is why so many of them described the same specific encounters, the same shadow in the same kind of doorway, the same weight on the edge of the bed, the same touch on the same shoulder. The brain's presence detector explains a feeling, a vague, formless dread, a sense of not being alone. It is harder to explain why strangers who never spoke to one another, separated by oceans, kept reporting details that matched, as though they were all describing a single thing from slightly different angles. The official answer draws the picture beautifully right up to the edge of the frame, and then, at the very edge, it leaves the door open just a crack, wide enough for the question to slip through and refuse to leave. So sit for a moment with what that year really was, when you strip away everything we tell ourselves to feel safe. For more than 12 months, a greater share of humanity than at any other point in modern history sat still, alone, in silence, in old houses and quiet rooms, through the long empty hours of the night, with the noise of the world switched off all around them. It was, though no one designed it as one, the largest experiment in stillness our species has ever undergone. Billions of people, all at once, doing the one thing we almost never do, being quiet and being alone, and listening. And what so many of them reported hearing back was a presence. There are two ways to read what happened in those silent rooms, and neither one is comforting. The first is the rational one, that the stillness turned us inward, that our overstrained minds populated the emptiness with ghosts of their own making, that we frightened ourselves in the dark the way human beings always have, only this time all together, all at once, that the houses were empty and always had been, and the only thing that changed was us. But the second reading is the one that lingers after you've turned off the lights. What if the houses were never as empty as we believed? What if the presences people felt that year were not invented by the silence, but revealed by it? For all the long centuries of human life, our homes have been full of noise, voices, footsteps, traffic, the endless churn of activity that drowns out the smaller, stranger sounds beneath. And then, for one extraordinary year, the noise stopped, the static cleared, and in the silence underneath, an enormous number of people, in an enormous number of places, all reported sensing the same thing standing quietly in the room with them. Maybe we simply, finally, grew quiet enough to notice what had been there all along, sharing our hallways, sitting at the foot of our beds, watching from the doorways of houses we had always thought of as our own. Or maybe, and this is the thought that doesn't let go, the stillness itself was an invitation. Maybe something about all of us going quiet at once, all of us alone and listening at the same moment across the whole turning world, opened a space that is normally kept closed, and maybe something, somewhere, noticed the silence too, and moved closer to the light we'd left on, 24 hours a day, in an old farmhouse in Rhode Island, and in a million ordinary homes besides. The streets are loud again now. The planes are back in the sky, the traffic hums, the world has filled itself with noise the way it always does, and the reports have faded back toward the margins where they usually live. Whatever that year stirred up has gone quiet again, buried once more beneath the comfortable din of ordinary life. But it was there. The records show the surge was real. The sightings, the sensed presences, the searches, the strangers separated by oceans describing the same shape in the same dark doorway. For one long year, the world held its breath and listened, and a great many people, in a great many quiet rooms, are still certain that something listened back. So I'll leave the question with you, the way the silence left it with all of us. Did the lockdowns simply make us still enough at last to notice the things that have always shared our homes? Or did the quiet open a door and let something in? When the world went silent, what do you think was really standing in the room? If this case unsettled something in you, stay with us in the dark a while longer, follow along, and we'll keep walking through the unexplained together, one quiet room at a time.